We're going to be talking about the kidneys. The first thing we have to notice is that the kidney is composed of an outer cortex, a medulla. The nephrons are in the medulla and the cortex. There's also a calyx that stores urine. We have a pelvic area where urine passes. And we have the hilums, which is composed of the afferent arterioles, the renal veins, and the ureters. Now, the afferent arterioles come from outside of the body from an artery, and they go into the kidney. Think of A as in arrival. So they're supplying all of the blood into the kidney, and eventually it's going to reach an afferent arteriole. Afferent for exit, it's going to exit the kidney, and eventually it's going to join with capillaries and then go to the renal vein. The vein is the one that takes blood away from the kidneys into the rest of systemic circulations. The ureters are the ones that carry the urine down to the bladder. Now, the nephrons are composed of the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a convoluted area of blood vessels that abstracts or filters out proteins, especially the small proteins, into what is called the Bowman's capsule. So it looks like a bow, and it's properly named because it filters everything inside. So the filtrate is going to go down into what is called the proximal convoluted tubule. So the proximal convoluted tubule, that's going to increase the reabsorption of molecules like sodium, sugar, salt, chlorine, among many things, potassium. And then we go down into what is called the descending loop of Henle. So the descending loop of Henle is going to reabsorb water, and I'm going to explain why. As you go down, it reabsorbs more and more water. Okay, and then we have the ascending loop of Henle, which is not permeable to water, but it is to salts like sodium. So that means that if sodium is being reabsorbed by the cells that are next to the tubules, then there's going to be a higher concentration as we go down. So there's going to be a gradient of sodium, and water is always going to follow sodium. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule. It's called distal because it's farther away from the Bowman's capsule. So distal convoluted tubule is similar to the proximal convoluted tubule, but the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs the most amount, like around 65% of salts and the molecules. The distal convoluted tubule absorbs less. And finally, we have what is called the collecting duct. In here, we have water being reabsorbed. So basically what's happening here is we have all of these nephrons that have a lot of convoluted areas that are going to filter out the blood, incoming blood, and they're going to concentrate the urine. The urine is passing through the blue area, okay? So it's passing through all of this, and eventually it's going to go into the ureters and out into the bladder. Now, the afferent arteriole is the one that's incoming, so this would be the afferent, and then eventually we get what's called the afferent arteriole that's going to branch into what's called capillaries. These capillaries from the afferent arteriole are going to reabsorb all of the nutrients that are being collected here. So if it wants to reabsorb sodium, it's going to reabsorb sodium. If it's going to reabsorb water, and it's going to collect the water. This countercurrent multiplier system basically consists of an ascending concentration of sodium. For example, we have more sodium on the bottom than on the top. So that means that water is going to follow out. And we have all of these capillaries obtaining all of these nutrients and sending it back out into the renal vein to the rest of the systemic circulation. And here what we have is we have what are called juxtaglomerular cells and also macula densa. So juxtaglomerular cells are part of this area, this whole area over here, the glomerulus with the arterioles. Okay, and it's composed of cells that are secreting what is called renin. Renin is the protease that is part of increasing blood pressure. And I'll explain this chain reaction later. So we have juxtaglomerular cells. Okay, so juxtaglomerular cells that are secreting renin. Those are the only ones that secrete renin. Okay, then we have what are called macula densa. The macula densa are cells that are in the distal convoluted tubule over here, and they're responsible for releasing prostaglandins. And how do they do this? When they sense that sodium levels are low, okay, because of low blood pressure. So we know that we have, if somebody, for example, if Bob over here takes a high amount of salt, sodium chloride, it's going to go down into the kidneys, into blood, and we're going to have a lot of salt being actually excreted in the filtrate. So it's going to be excreted in the urine. The opposite is also true. So if we have low sodium chloride, we have a low level of salt, okay, in the filtrate. We're going to try to reabsorb. So somehow these cells, the macula densa senses that in the filtrate there's a low level of sodium because there's a low pressure. So what it's going to do, it's going to send prostaglandins down to the juxtaglomerular cells to release renin. And renin is the protease that activates liver angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 using an ACE enzyme, an angiotensin converting enzyme. Now that enzyme is found in the endothelial cells as well as in the lungs. So what it does is just activates the angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 does the effects of a high blood pressure. It's going to increase vasoconstriction of smooth muscle. It's going to increase stroke volume by increasing the amount of water reuptake. And it's also going to release antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin from the posterior pituitary gland. And it's also going to act on the cortex, the adrenal cortex, to release aldosterone. Okay, so the first thing that we have to talk about in terms of aldosterone is that aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal cortex, and it is secreted as a result of low blood pressure. So we have, for example, a sympathetic nervous system that has nerves that innervate the adrenal cortex and tells it to secrete aldosterone because it wants a higher blood pressure. And then how does it do this? It does this by increasing sodium reuptake in both the distal and convoluted ducts of the nephron. So if we go back, we're looking at the distal, which is this one. Okay, so this is the distal convoluted, and then we have the collecting duct of the nephron. It's going to increase sodium reuptake by promoting sodium channels, and at the same time, where sodium goes, water follows. So it's not going to increase the osmolarity because there's the same amount of sodium and water, but it is increasing the volume and the pressure. It's increasing the stroke volume. Okay, now vasopressin. So let's take a closer look at the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, it's going to synthesize vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, and it's going to send it down its axons to the posterior pituitary, which stores it and then releases it. So vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone responds to a low osmolarity. Okay, in order to it responds to high osmolarity. Okay, so we have high osmolarity, that means we have a lot of concentrated salts and solutes in blood. We're going to get vasopressin acting to reabsorb the water from the collecting duct so that the osmolarity goes down. And it does this, vasopressin does this by upregulating what are called aquaporins on the collecting duct, allowing water to go in. So that is vasopressin, and that is aldosterone. They have two different pathways, but they both increase blood pressure. And in terms of the Stirling forces in the Bowman capsule and the glomerulus, we know that the hydrostatic pressure is a little bit bigger than the osmotic pressure, which results in a net pull of small amino acids and molecules into the filtrate. And please notice that the big proteins do not go through, because think of this as a filter. It filters out the big ones and then gets and collects the small ones. Okay, so also what one needs to take into consideration is that when there is a a high level of hydronium ions because we have an acidic blood pH, what happens is we're going to do the opposite of this reaction. So usually we get H2O plus carbon dioxide forms bicarbonate, and then bicarbonate spontaneously attaches into hydronium ions and carbonate, and hydrogen carbonate, bicarbonate. Okay, so this is what happens with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, you don't find it free floating around. You find it in this form, in hydrogen bicarbonate. And when we have an acidic pH, the hydrogen concentration goes up. And if it goes up, then that forces the reaction according to Le Chatelier's principle to the left. So what's going to happen, we're going to get H2O and CO2. So first in the tubule, we're going to expel out in the urine a lot of the hydrogens, okay, to remove that acidic pH. And then in the blood, we're going to transform the H2CO3 into H2O plus CO2. So we're basically transforming that proton into H2O and carbon dioxide, and that proton that's being collected in those cells near the tubules are going to be excreted into the urine. And that's a way to prevent acidic pH. Usually you have an acidic pH when it's a little bit below 7.3. Okay, our normal pH for blood is 7.3, 7.4, around there. And that's pretty much it.